When emergency crews arrived at this Boeing 707 in a French onion field, they made a chilling discovery that would haunt them forever. The plane hadn't exploded. The fuselage wasn't torn apart. In fact, from the outside, it looked almost normal. But inside, 123 people sat motionless in their seats. Not injured, not burned, just dead. How could nearly everyone on a plane that successfully landed die before touching the ground? The answer begins with something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that you'd never believe it could kill over 100 people in minutes. In 1973, a fatal design flaw turned Varig Flight 820 into a flying tomb. The passengers never stood a chance. And the most terrifying part, the pilots had no idea what was happening to everyone behind them. This is the story of how a single cigarette created one of aviation's most disturbing disasters and why the rescue team arrived to find a plane full of people who looked peaceful, as if they were simply asleep. On July 10th, 1973, at Rio de Janeiro's Galo International Airport, the passengers were calm and at ease as they boarded Varig Flight 820, set for Paris with a brief stop in Lima. The aircraft was a Boeing 707-320C, a special convertible variant that could switch between passenger and cargo operations. Built in 1968, it had accumulated just over 20,000 flight hours. Everything about the plane checked out perfectly. Among the passengers were Brazilian musician Agostinho dos Santos and Felinto Müller, the president of Brazil's upper house, celebrating his 73rd birthday. In the cockpit, Captain Gilberto Aho Dilva, one of Varig's most experienced pilots with nearly 18,000 flight hours, led an extended crew of 8 pilots, though only 4 would be in the cockpit when disaster struck. The year was 1973, and air travel was different then. Smoking wasn't just permitted, it was expected. Every armrest had a built-in ashtray, and nobody thought twice about lighting up at 35,000 feet. At 11:30 p.m., Flight 820 took off from Rio de Janeiro, making a brief stop in Lima before continuing across the Atlantic. As night turned to morning and Paris drew closer, passengers dozed peacefully into the dimmed cabin. None of them knew that a fatal flaw in 1970s aircraft design was about to turn their routine flight into a disaster. As Flight 820 approached Paris-Orly Airport on July 11th, controllers gave them instructions for runway 26, but something was about to go terribly wrong. At precisely 1:58 p.m. Paris time, as the aircraft was making its approach, a flight attendant noticed smoke coming from the rear lavatory. "Paris Control, Varig 820. We have smoke in the cabin." "Roger. Varig 820. What is your situation?" Within moments, the situation escalated dramatically. The pilots radioed the ground, reporting they were having a problem with fire on board. The approach controllers immediately altered their plans. Instead of the original approach to runway 26, they offered the crew a straight-in approach to runway 07 on the north side of the airport, the quickest path to the ground. But when she opened the door, she found no one inside. The smoke was getting thicker. Within seconds, she could see it curling up from behind the plastic panels. This wasn't cigarette smoke. It was darker, heavier. She immediately notified the senior crew member. "Captain, we have smoke in the rear lavatory. No visible fire, but smoke is increasing." By now, other flight attendants had gathered at the back of the aircraft. They grabbed the nearest fire extinguisher, but there was a problem. They couldn't see where to aim it. The smoke seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Captain, smoke is getting worse. Can't see the source." "Understood. Tell passengers to move forward." In the passenger cabin, the first few rows of passengers remained oblivious to the situation developing behind them. But those seated near the back had already begun to notice something was wrong. The air was becoming thicker, harder to breathe. Within minutes, the situation worsened quickly. What had begun as a small amount of smoke from a single lavatory quickly spread, filling the cabin. Visibility plummeted, and passengers in the rear sections began coughing uncontrollably. The crew struggled to locate the source of the fire, but their efforts were in vain. The smoke blocked everything from view, filling the air with a sharp, acrid scent that stung their throats and blurred their vision. What they were dealing with wasn't ordinary smoke. It was something far more dangerous. As panic spread through the cabin, passengers looked up in desperation, expecting the oxygen masks to drop from the ceiling. But they never came. The masks weren't there, and they couldn't be. In 1973, aircraft oxygen systems weren't designed to help in smoke situations. The designers had assumed that any smoke would be quickly ventilated from the cabin, but they hadn't accounted for toxic smoke from burning plastics and materials that wouldn't exist for another decade. The scene in the cabin was becoming chaotic. Passengers were now struggling to breathe, some already slumping in their seats. The flight attendants, trained for almost every emergency, found themselves facing a situation their manuals hadn't prepared them for. In the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Following Varig's emergency procedures, the flight engineer cut several electrical systems, inadvertently making their instruments unreliable. With smoke now entering the cockpit, the pilots donned their oxygen masks, but visibility through the windshield was becoming severely limited. They had only 2 to 3 minutes from when the problem was first noticed before smoke completely filled the cockpit. Captain Dilva realized they wouldn't make it to the runway. Even with the straight-in approach, they were still several miles from the airport. With instruments failing and toxic smoke filling every compartment of the aircraft, he made the decision that would determine the fate of everyone on board. They would attempt an emergency landing in an onion field ahead of the aircraft. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Whether they succeeded or failed, this plane was coming down. The lives of everyone aboard depended on the next few minutes. There was no second chance. Mayday, 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 this is Varig 820. Heavy smoke, losing visibility. Varig 820 cleared immediate descent. Emergency services alerted. As the plane descended through 15,000 feet, something terrifying was happening inside the cabin. The smoke had become so dense that even the cockpit crew were having trouble seeing their instruments. But more worryingly, the calls and coughs from the passenger cabin had grown quieter. Too quiet, in fact. Through the smoke-filled cockpit, Captain Dilva could barely see his instruments. The toxic fumes were overwhelming the flight crew. It was now 4:03 p.m. local time, and Varig Flight 820 was making its final approach approximately 5 kilometers short of Paris-Orly Airport. Cannot make the runway. Too much smoke. Field ahead looks clear. Just before touching down in the onion field, Captain Dilva lifted the nose and banked slightly to the left. The aircraft skimmed over the tops of small trees before making contact with the ground. Brace! 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 The impact was devastating. The landing gear was immediately ripped from the plane, causing the fuselage to collapse onto the field where it began to skid. The engines were torn from the wings as the massive aircraft careened through the field. Yet somehow, remarkably, the main cabin section remained intact. Emergency vehicles, already mobilized, raced towards the crash site through the afternoon light. But inside the aircraft, a silent tragedy had already played out. As the rescue teams approached the downed aircraft, they anticipated seeing passengers scrambling to escape. But when they reached the plane, something was terribly wrong. The cabin was eerily still. There were no cries for help, no desperate movements, just silence. There were no signs of life. When firefighters breached the cabin door, they were met with a sight that would haunt them forever. As the fire continued to burn in the field, it began to melt the aircraft's skin, the ceiling gradually caving in. The intense heat and toxic smoke had transformed the cabin into a scene of unspeakable tragedy. The structural damage from the crash was surprisingly minimal. It was the fire that had done the real damage. The silence was suffocating, and the sight of them frozen in place sent a cold shiver down the spines of the rescue teams. The rescuers, wearing breathing apparatus, made their way through the smoke-filled cabin. As they checked for survivors, a chilling reality became clear. They were too late. The 123 passengers who lost their lives didn't die from the crash or fire. They had succumbed to something far more insidious: carbon monoxide poisoning. Only 11 people survived that morning, 10 crew members and a single passenger, 21-year-old Ricardo Trano. The fact that most survivors were crew members would later raise crucial questions about emergency procedures and access to safety equipment. Among them was Captain Dilva, who had managed to crash-land the aircraft while on the verge of unconsciousness himself. An extraordinary feat of airmanship in the most dire circumstances. But how could a simple lavatory fire lead to such devastating loss of life in a plane that successfully crash-landed? The answer lay in what investigators found when they examined the rear bathroom. In the lavatory waste bin, beneath the layers of paper towels and tissue, they discovered the source: the remnants of a cigarette. But this wasn't just about someone breaking the no-smoking rule. The investigation revealed a perfect storm of fatal design flaws that turned a small fire into a catastrophe. The lavatory waste bins of that era were made of flammable plastic. When the cigarette ignited the papers inside, it created a smoldering fire that melted through the bin. As it burned, it released hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide, two of the deadliest gases known to man. The aircraft's ventilation system, designed to keep passengers comfortable, actually worked against them. As the toxic smoke was produced, it was pulled into the cabin's air circulation system. Instead of venting it outside, the system distributed the poisonous gases throughout the entire aircraft. The passengers never stood a chance. At cruising altitude, where the air is already thin, it took only minutes for the carbon monoxide to render them unconscious. Most were likely unaware of what was happening to them. The investigation revealed that the carbon monoxide levels in the cabin had reached over 1,500 parts per million, enough to cause unconsciousness in just 2 to 3 breaths. The oxygen masks, which might have saved lives in a different emergency, were useless against the toxic smoke. But perhaps the most tragic revelation was that this wasn't the first time such an incident had occurred. Similar lavatory fires had been reported before, but none had led to such catastrophic loss of life. It took this disaster to expose just how vulnerable aircraft of that era were to toxic smoke. The cigarette that started the fire was never matched to any specific passenger. The real culprit wasn't the person who discarded it. It was a system of aircraft design that had overlooked a critical vulnerability. As investigators put together the final moments of Flight 820, they revealed a story of silent bravery. Even though he was poisoned by the same toxic gases that killed his passengers, Captain Dilva managed to crash-land the plane in a way that kept the fuselage mostly intact. It was an incredible act of skill under impossible conditions. But sadly, this heroic effort came too late to save those on board. The tragedy of Varig Flight 820 forced the aviation industry to confront an uncomfortable question. How could a single cigarette bring down a modern airliner? Today, when you step onto a modern airliner, you're surrounded by safety features born from this tragedy. The lavatory smoke detectors, sophisticated air management systems, and fire-resistant waste bins all trace their origins to Flight 820. But these changes came at an enormous cost. 123 lives were lost in that onion field near Paris, a stark reminder that in aviation, safety regulations are often written in blood. Yet there's one final twist to this story. Captain Dilva, who had saved 11 lives through his skillful crash landing, returned to flying with Varig. But in 1979, while piloting another Boeing 707 from Tokyo to Los Angeles, his aircraft vanished without a trace. The captain who had once cheated death would ultimately join the passengers he couldn't save. Each year, on July 11th, a small ceremony is held near the crash site, The field where Flight 820 came to rest has long since returned to growing onions, but the lessons learned there continue to protect air travelers to this day. One simple mistake turned a passenger plane into a death trap at 24,000 feet. But in 2023, another pilot found herself in a fight for survival. Not over France, but deep in the shadow of the Himalayas. Click the video on your screen to discover how a routine landing turned into Nepal's deadliest aviation disaster, captured live on social media.